Hello and welcome to another practical. In this video I will talk about tracking disruptors. I will cover two main topics. One is why people use tracking disruptors and the other is how to use them effectively. Now before we start, I want to stress that everything that I will cover applies to solo PvP in frigates. So do not take this advice and try to apply it to fleet PvP or to cruiser solo PvP and above. Some things will be applicable, but some things will be different. So just keep in mind that all of this stuff is for frigate solo PvP. Okay, let's start with the basics. So what is a tracking disruptor? This is a medium slot module that can, if you want, be loaded with a script. There are two types of scripts. One will reduce optimal range and the other will reduce tracking speed. So this is an active module. You target your opponent when you activate this module, and it will reduce either optimal range of your opponent's guns or tracking speed or both. So you will have to select if you load the script when the tracking disruptor will be highly effective against one thing but not effective against the other, or if you run it unscripted, it will be effective against both but not to the same degree. On average, it depends on the module itself, hit, your skills, and so on. But on average, the ballpark number is about minus 40% for scripted tracking disruptor and minus 20% for unscripted tracking disruptor. Tracking disruptors are very common in faction warfare feats for solo PvP. The majority of characters will have a tracking disruptor for mitigation, with a couple of exceptions like Succubus and Garmor come to mind. And some scrum range frigates with plenty of medium slots will also quite often use tracking disruptor. The most common example is the hookbill. In general, in terms of PvP meta, this is one of the forms of electronic warfare control. So you have webs, scrums, propulsion modules for natural non-EOR control, and when you have newts, tracking disruptors, and so on for electronic warfare control. Ultimately, both of these types of control help you to minimize the damage you take from your opponent while maximizing the damage you inflict on your opponent. And as an example, you can see on the picture, there are two 10mm Navy catalysts with 120mm railguns and antimatter loaded. One is without tracking disruptor, and the other, the red one, is with tracking disruptor applied. And you can see that beyond certain point, tracking disruption optimal range significantly reduces the DPS that you take. Now, in reality, of course, the difference will not be as massive because Catalyst Navy that is tracking disrupted will likely just switch to a longer range ammo, but nevertheless, the DPS that you take will be quite a bit lower with a tracking disruptor than without it. Now, it's important to know that tracking disruptors only work against guns and drones. They do not work against missiles. A while ago, we had just a single tracking disruptor module that worked against anything, and then CCP thought that this is too powerful, and they split tracking disruptors between tracking disruptor that works against guns or drones and tracking disruptor that works against missiles, and the latter is called missile disruptor. Now, the missile disruptor is much weaker than a tracking disruptor, so you don't really see it that often. I would say the only case where missile disruptor is used is in something like hookbill against hookbill mirrors, where you just don't have any other module to fit really. Since you already have two webs and a tracking disruptor, and tracking disruptor is useless, well, third web does not make much sense, and you can't fit any tank because you are armor or hull tanked. So what's left is the missile disruptor because there's just nothing else to do. But other than that, it's quite rare. Now, it also works against drones. It's fairly niche use. But in some cases, when you fight against a worm, for example, it's pointless to track and disrupt a worm because it's a missile frigate. But it makes sense to track and disrupt a drone, since it's almost half of worm's DPS, and even if you reduce it by a little bit, then it makes sense. But overall, mostly use track and disruptor against guns. Okay, and a couple of rules. This is probably the most useful part of this video. It's not that complicated, really. You have a couple of rules that apply in the vast majority of situations. So if you know when you will get close to a maximum value out of your tracking disruptor. Okay, so the first rule is when you fight against short-range small guns, so things like autocannons, blasters, or pulses, you practically always disrupt for optimal range. Because disrupting against optimal range, against guns that already have very short range, just gives you the highest mitigation possible. And these guns typically have very high tracking, so disrupting them on tracking does not make much difference. Now, if you fight against long-range small guns, so these are artillery, railguns, or beams, it depends on your archetype. If you kite, it's always optimal range. This will give you the highest mitigation, as you can see on the previous slide, for example, here. So imagine if you're a kiter, you're chilling around 20 kilometers, it just makes a lot of difference in terms of damage that you take. Now, and if you are close range, scrum range, typically frigate when you use tracking disruption on tracking speed, because you will try to mitigate by breaking that tracking. These guns have high range but low tracking, so it makes sense to try to break tracking close range. Now, against Triglavian stuff, always optimal range, because Triglavian guns have a relatively short optimal range and they just don't work beyond their optimal range at all. And fairly high tracking, so it's very similar to short range small guns, just disrupt on optimal range. And finally, against medium or large guns, so let's say when you're in a frigate fighting against a cruiser, in the majority of situations you disrupt on tracking. So even when you fight against a weapon type that is long range, disruption on tracking generally gives you better mitigation even if you kite. There are a couple of exceptions. For example, the most notable probably is when you fight against something like Harbinger with Scorch, or Pulse Harbinger with Scorch. To a lesser degree, something like an Omen. Omen Navy probably still want to disrupt on tracking simply because they just have too long of optimal range and so on. But in the majority of cases, as I said, you get maximum mitigation by disrupting on tracking. And this is pretty much it. So this is the majority of stuff that you need to know to use tracking disruption effectively. So I hope you found it useful, and I will see you in the next practicals.